Billions of people died so the Tyranids couldn't eat them. That sentence is worth sitting with, not as abstraction, but as policy. Signed orders, inquisitorial seals, planets full of farmers and forge workers and children who prayed to the god emperor every morning, reduced to ash by the same Imperium that claimed their fealty. No evacuation fleets, no last transports, just fire from orbit and silence. The man who gave that order wasn't insane. He wasn't rogue. He was Inquisitor Lord Fidus Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos, the Imperium's foremost expert on the Tyranid menace, the person who first named them, the analyst who warned Marneus Calgar himself before the First Tyrannic War and was proven right. He had more credentials than anyone alive to understand what was coming. And when it came, he looked at the math and concluded that billions had to die so trillions might survive. The Inquisition issued him what the canonical record calls a Carta Extremis, or a related designation, depending on the source. For it, stripped of his title, made a fugitive. Then the canonical record called him the Saviour of the Imperium. Then Games Workshop published an article titled, "The Octarius Sector is Hell, and it's all Inquisitor Kryptman's fault." Both positions are official. Both are accurate. That's the problem. This is his case file. To understand what Kryptman did, you need to understand what he knew and how long he'd known it before anyone else believed him. His career predates the Tyrannic Wars entirely. He served as an Inquisitor Lord of the Ordo Xenos and earned the designation Hero of the Macharian Heresy, meaning by the time the great alien swarms appeared on Imperial censors, he wasn't a junior analyst. He was a senior authority with decades of service cataloging threats humanity didn't know existed. During his career, according to the fandom Warhammer wiki, drawing on canonical sources, he documented 82 new intelligent alien species. That number hasn't been independently confirmed in a primary codex in the sources available, so treat it as a wiki-sourced figure rather than a settled canon constant. But even if the actual number is 60 or 40, the point stands. This was a man who spent his professional life staring at the galaxy's unknown margins and writing down what stared back. The First Tyrannic War began in 745 M41. Hive Fleet Behemoth hit the eastern fringe and drove hard toward Macragge. Before it arrived, before the Space Marine chapters scrambled and the void battles began, Kryptman was already moving. The Warhammer community article, Official Games Workshop, confirms it directly. He warned Marneus Calgar of the coming threat and allowed the Space Marines ample time to prepare. The chapter master of the Ultramarines listened. The preparations held. Behemoth was ultimately defeated, though at tremendous cost. Here's where the naming comes in. The Tyranids take their name from the planet Tyran, the world Kryptman found stripped bare. Every living thing consumed. Silence where there had once been life. He named the threat. He gave Calgar the warning. And the Goonhammer lore team, one of the most thorough editorial operations in the hobby, identifies him as the Inquisitor who gave the Tyranids their name and helped create the Imperium strategy for dealing with the extragalactic menace. A brief aside on names. Tyran was in the eastern fringe, adjacent to Ultramar. The community has spent years quietly noting that if Kryptman had found a different world first, one a bit closer to Macragge, the galaxy's most horrifying alien race might have been called the Macraggids. That joke pulled over 1,100 engagement comments on another channel's coverage of this lore, which tells you something about what Warhammer audiences reward. They reward accuracy, and they reward wit. Both are in short supply when the subject turns to what Kryptman did next. The Second Tyrannic War arrived in 992 M41 with Hive Fleet Kraken, a fleet that, unlike Behemoth, split into multiple tendrils rather than driving a single spear. Kryptman's involvement in Kraken's war is poorly documented in surviving sources. One low-authority fan compilation references him finding an alien artifact aboard a space hulk that signaled another fleet's approach, a kind of early warning system moment. But that source is a GeoCities archive and the details can't be cross-referenced. What matters is the pattern. By the time Kraken came and went, Kryptman had survived 2 Tyrannic Wars. He'd watched 2 hive fleets grind into Imperial space. He'd studied their consumption patterns, their advance rates, their biomass harvesting methodology, with the obsessive precision of a man who understood that the next fleet would be worse. He was right. In 997 M41, Hive Fleet Leviathan arrived. Leviathan was categorically different from its predecessors. It didn't attack from the eastern fringe like Behemoth or Kraken. It came from below the galactic plane, a direction the Imperium's defenses weren't oriented toward, bypassing the overlapping warning networks that might have bought time. Multiple tendrils, massive scale. The forge world of Griffon 4, home of the Legio Griffonicus Titan Legion, was consumed. That's not a border settlement. That's an industrial powerhouse, a world that produced titans, gone. The scale of loss wasn't theoretical anymore. Kryptman developed what became known as the Kryptman Census, a systematic effort to map Leviathan's advance by tracking astropathic silence. The Tyranids project the shadow in the warp, a psychic interference field that disrupts warp-based communication. Worlds fall silent before they fall. By burning out dozens of astropaths in mass communication attempts, and noting which worlds stopped answering, Kryptman could chart the swarm's projected path with terrible precision. He knew where Leviathan was going, he knew how fast it was moving, and he knew that at its current rate, the Ultima Segmentum was facing a consumption event that conventional Imperial defense couldn't stop. So he ordered the corridor. The Exterminatus cordon is the case for the prosecution. Let's lay it out. Kryptman identified worlds along Leviathan's projected advance path and ordered their complete biological destruction. Exterminatus, the total sterilization of a planetary biosphere. Not always after evacuation, not as a last resort when defense failed, timed, deliberately, to the moment the Tyranids were descending to feed. According to the Daka form analysis drawing on canonical codex material, Kryptman theorized that in this manner the swarms would expend great resources to claim a world, only to have every living thing upon it reduced to ash. The Tyranids would attack, they would overwhelm defenses, they would begin consumption, and then there would be nothing to consume. The biomass gone, the energy spent for zero return. The population of those worlds was part of the calculation, at least in the cases where evacuation didn't occur first. And the canonical record indicates both happened. Some worlds were evacuated and then destroyed preemptively, while others were burned just as the Tyranids descended to feed upon the populace already present. For the second category, the people dying was the mechanism. Tyranid consumption of living biomass sustains the swarm. Kryptman was burning the food supply. Specific named systems in the canonical record for this corridor are sparse in available sources. The research couldn't pull a confirmed list of every world destroyed. What the sources do confirm is the scale. Multiple inhabited systems along a projected path, the kind of decision that doesn't get made once and questioned, but gets made repeatedly, system after system, as Leviathan continued its advance. Griffon 4 was consumed by Leviathan directly. Tarsus Ultra saw the first major Imperial victory against Leviathan in 999 M41. A defensive battle, not part of the cordon, but evidence that the strategy bought enough time for at least one victory to occur. The Daka page 3 analysis, summarizing canonical material, states plainly, the cordon strategy involved exterminatus on worlds the Tyranids were already attacking, and which the Imperium couldn't defend anyway. That last phrase carries weight. The Steelman version of Kryptman's position is this. These worlds were already lost. Leviathan was already consuming them, or about to. The choice wasn't between exterminatus and survival. The choice was between exterminatus and feeding the swarm that would then have more biomass to throw at the next world and the world after that. Deny the resource, starve the advance, buy time. There is a version of Kryptman in which this math is defensible. Then comes the question no source can fully answer. Can you actually starve a Tyranid hive fleet? This is the part the script has to be honest about, because the canonical record is genuinely incomplete here. Hive Fleet Leviathan, like Behemoth and Kraken before it, crossed intergalactic void to reach the Milky Way. The distances involved are measured in hundreds of thousands of light years. There's no biomass in the void between galaxies. The swarm sustained itself somehow. Hibernation, internal reserves, some metabolic process the Imperium doesn't fully understand. One Reddit thread aggregating lore discussions references Tyranid ships entering hibernation during long-distance travel, but this isn't confirmed in a primary codex in the sources available. The honest answer is, we don't know if the starvation logic actually works against a species that demonstrably survived the crossing between galaxies without eating anything. That uncertainty is part of the horror. Kryptman condemned billions of people across entire inhabited star systems. That death toll runs into the billions as a matter of scale, though it isn't a figure the Codex puts a precise number to death for a strategy whose biological premises may be partially or entirely false. He may have been right. He may have been spectacularly, irreversibly wrong. The sources confirm the corridor worked in the sense that Leviathan slowed, but community analysis of that outcome is split on whether the cordon caused the slowdown or whether Leviathan's own operational tempo was already different from Behemoth's. We know Kryptman burned the worlds. We know Leviathan advanced more slowly than projected. We can't confirm with certainty that the first caused the second. The prosecution's most brutal exhibit is the evacuation question. The Daka page 3 source does mention some worlds being evacuated or destroyed preemptively, suggesting evacuation wasn't universally abandoned. But the primary characterization across sources is of populations condemned in place, consumed not by Tyranids but by Imperial fire. If evacuation happened in some cases and not others, that's even more damning in a way. It means Kryptman and his staff made individual calculations about which populations merited transport and which didn't. The evidence stops short of confirming exactly which worlds received which treatment. What it confirms is that the decision was made repeatedly, and the Inquisition eventually decided it had gone too far. The Inquisition's response is documented, if terminologically messy. Kryptman was issued a Carta Extremis and stripped of his title. That's the language in the fandom wiki, which draws on canonical source material. Other sources use excommunication or reference the excommunicate Traitoris designation. The terminology varies by source. The exact legal designation is contested across the canonical record. What isn't contested is the result. The Ordo Xenos' foremost Tyranid expert became a fugitive, unable to hold formal authority, operating outside the Inquisition's sanction. His exact punishment, whether Carta Extremis, excommunication, or a related designation, varies by source, but the outcome is consistent across all of them. The Fandom Inquisition wiki notes something worth flagging. Being excommunicated does not strip an Inquisitor of any real status, for they are still able to command the fear and respect of others simply by virtue of. The text truncates there, but the implication is clear. The Inquisition's formal sanction is a legal and institutional judgment. Its practical effect on a man with Kryptman's authority and network of loyal Deathwatch warriors is a different matter entirely. The Daka community analysis, lower authority but articulating what the canonical sources imply, frames the Inquisition's decision this way. Kryptman's plan worked, but at a huge cost to the Imperium, and he needed to be sacrificed so that other Inquisitors wouldn't get any ideas. That framing is cold. It also rings true. The Inquisition wasn't saying Kryptman was wrong. It was saying that an Inquisitor who demonstrated the willingness to burn entire star systems of loyal Imperial citizens required a visible institutional response, regardless of outcome, because the alternative was normalizing the behavior. This is how institutions manage strategists who win by methods the institution can't publicly endorse. Here's where the case file gets complicated. Kryptman didn't stop. His loyal Deathwatch kill teams stayed with him after the Carta Extremis. And with those teams, he designed a second operation, one that didn't burn any worlds, at least not directly. One that was arguably more dangerous than the Exterminatus corridor in its long-term consequences. He needed live gene stealers. Kryptman personally led several specially equipped Death Watch teams into the caverns of Carpathia to attempt to capture a living gene-stealer brood. Lexicanum confirms this. The mission itself is the kind of operation that gets written into Death Watch sagas, going underground on an infected world, taking live specimens of one of the most lethal organisms in the galaxy, doing it with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent 50 years studying these creatures and knew exactly how dangerous every second of the operation was. They got the gene stealers, then Kryptman loaded them onto a space hulk, the specific vessel isn't named in available sources, and directed it toward the Octarius Sector. The Warhammer community confirms the diversion occurred. Leviathan turned toward Octarius. The orcs were already there, a massive population of highly aggressive organisms with enormous biomass potential and the singular quality of fighting back extremely hard. The most plausible inference is that the gene stealers aboard served as a lure, detectable through whatever biological and psychic mechanisms the hive mind uses to sense living prey. But the precise mechanics of how the Space Hulk redirected an entire hive fleet rather than simply attracting a tendril aren't elaborated in the sources. What the sources confirm is the outcome. Hive Fleet Leviathan, following the hunger that drives every Tyranid decision, turned toward Octarius. 2 existential threats, 1 sector. Kryptman locked them together and walked away. The Warhammer community's official article on the resulting conflict carries the title, "The Octarius Sector is Hell, and it's all Inquisitor Kryptman's fault." That's an official Games Workshop publication. That's the company that makes the setting, calling one of its own lore figures directly responsible for a catastrophe in the title of the article. The fandom wiki, drawing on canonical sources, describes Kryptman in a different entry as the savior of the Imperium during the Third Tyrannic War. Both sentences are in the official lore. Neither is wrong. The Octarius War escalated beyond anything conventional Imperial forces could manage. Tyranids and orcs locked in mutual slaughter, the war grinding on at scales the Imperium couldn't manage through conventional deployment. Warhammer community's coverage of the war's escalation states plainly that it's rapidly spiraling out of control. The conflict grew to the point that kill team operations became the primary Imperial response, because sending conventional forces into Octarius means feeding them to whichever side happens to be winning that week. The border worlds of the Ultima Segmentum are under active threat from the spillover. A war that Kryptman started as a diversionary tactic became a war that the Imperium now has to manage as an ongoing crisis of its own. The Daka Community Analysis, lower authority, summarizing the strategic outcome, states, "The Octarius gamble was a mistake that wasted the time the Cordon bought and drew in huge military resources that could have been used elsewhere." That's the prosecution's closing argument on the second count, offered by community analysis rather than official GW canon, but representing a coherent strategic counterposition worth naming. The defense argues something different. Leviathan diverted into Octarius stopped being Leviathan driving toward the Imperial core. The Tyranid-Orc war consumes resources on both sides. Every Tyranid organism expended fighting orcs in Octarius is an organism not consuming an Imperial world. From a certain angle, a cold, mathematical Kryptman-style angle, the gambit is still working. The war is still bleeding 2 enemies simultaneously. The Imperium hasn't had to face Leviathan at full strength since the diversion. At what cost, exactly, is the question. The most honest thing this case file can offer is the thing Kryptman himself apparently internalized from 50 years of watching institutions fail to act on accurate intelligence. Sometimes the right call and the defensible call are different calls, and the institution will punish you for the gap between them. Kryptman warned Calgar before 745 M41 and was proven right. He built the census methodology that allowed the Imperium to track Leviathan's advance. He ordered the Exterminatus corridor, and the evidence suggests it slowed the swarm, though the causal chain can't be confirmed with certainty. He designed the Octarius diversion that took Leviathan off the direct path to the Imperium's interior. He was issued a Carta Extremis and called a fugitive, then called the saviour of the Imperium, then accused of creating hell. The Imperium's formal verdict is that he went too far. The strategic record is that his interventions may be the reason the Ultima Segmentum still exists in a form worth defending. These two positions don't cancel each other out. They coexist uncomfortably, the way consequences usually do when someone does something irrevocable for reasons that weren't entirely wrong. The question of whether the Exterminatus corridor was justified depends on whether you believe billions of certain deaths across entire inhabited star systems, a toll that strains comprehension even without a codex-cited figure attached to it, can be traded against an uncertain probability of trillions of deaths, and on whether you believe Tyranid starvation actually works against a species that crossed intergalactic void on whatever reserves they carry. The canonical record can't fully settle that second part. Kryptman made the call without that certainty. So did every commander who signed an execution order during a siege, or a general who traded ground troops for an objective. The scale is different. The moral logic is disturbingly familiar. The question of whether the Octarius Gambit was justified is harder because the war Kryptman started there is still going. Rapidly spiraling out of control is present tense in official Games Workshop coverage. Kill team operations, border worlds under threat. An Orc-Tyranid conflict that has been escalating for long enough that the Imperium can no longer contain it through conventional means. Kryptman diverted one catastrophe into another, and the second one isn't finished yet. The Inquisition issued the Carta Extremis against the one man in the galaxy with the methodological background and the personal credibility to manage both crises. He's still out there, in whatever the lore's present tense means for an ex-Inquisitor operating with rogue Deathwatch support. The Octarius War is still burning. Leviathan's remnants are still active. The Ultima Segmentum is still being defended by an institution that formally declared the person who arguably saved it a criminal. That's the case file. You've seen the evidence. You know the charges. You know the outcomes confirmed by official sources and the outcomes that remain contested. You know what the corridor cost and what it bought, to the degree the canonical record lets you know anything. You know that Games Workshop itself can't decide whether Kryptman is a savior or a catastrophist, and publishes both positions without resolving them. The jury is you. The verdict is yours. If this kind of lore dissection is what you're here for, the cases that don't resolve cleanly, the figures the Imperium can't decide what to do with, subscribe. There are more files where this one came from.